Hello. The role-playing game industry is an unusual and seemingly untamable beast, not least when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, a game that, whilst much loved, has been through a great many changes over the years. My guest today was responsible for developing the second edition of that game, but before that, he joined TSR Wizards of the Coast to work on one of my favourite RPGs, Dark Matter, and whilst he was there, he helped to bring to life a vision of a brand new version of Chainmail, with the brief that that miniatures game had to go toe-to-toe with Games Workshop. And he also founded Green Ronin, the company that took on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and tried to rebuild it out of the ashes of Warhammer's Storm of Chaos. We talk about all of that and much, much more. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Chris Pramas. Chris, thanks so much for joining me. I thought we might start with a little bit about your career in role-playing games and how you got into the industry in the first place. What was your sort of beginning in RPGs?
Do you mean like the very beginning of getting into them or my career specifically?
I guess both, yeah. I mean, sort of, how did you get into them, and then how did that lead you into the industry, if it was that sort of that journey that you took?
Yeah. Well, way back in 1979, I was 10 years old, and that year I read Lord of the Rings and discovered D&D. And, you know, those two things like literally changed my life. So, I got super into it, into role-playing games and fantasy and science fiction and all that stuff. Began reading like Fritz Lieber and Michael Moorcock and, all this kind of stuff. And so started with D&D, then began to branch out. And then when I was in college, our game of choice was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which had just recently come out. And we played the hell out of that. We did the whole enemy within campaign and a bunch of the other adventures and things. And it was great. I mean, loved the world, loved the game. And so that led me to future events. But industry-wise, back when I was like 12, I remember thinking, like, someday I'd like to have an article in Dragon Magazine. Like, that was sort of the the scope of my ambition at the time. But then when I was in college, I started looking more seriously at it. And I did a little writing for a fanzine called Red Cap. It's an Ars Magica fanzine that a guy named Peter Henches used to do in the early 90s. So I wrote some articles for that. And then my first professional work was on Underground, Ray Whittinger's game from Mayfair. My friend Aaron Loeb, he and I had what we called a dark pact to help each other's creative careers. And so he had a contact at Mayfair Games, and I knew the game Underground. So together we got work. We blagged our way into work, and then it kind of grew from there, just freelancing for a bunch of different companies, and then starting my first company, which was just Ronin Publishing, in like 1995, and then I went to work for Wizards for 4 years, and in the middle of that time, I started Green Ronin. So it's
Right,
relatively short version. Yeah.
So you started your first company quite early then. It sounds like that, the original
Yes.
Ronin, yeah.
Yes. Foolishly so. Yes. uh, it's funny because Nicole, Nicole Linders, now my wife, at the time, she was like, "You probably shouldn't start this company." I was like, I come out of the punk rock scene, so I'm very much like a DIY sort of person. So after I had, a vaunted 2 years under my belt of freelancing, I was like, yes, But that company did not go well, but it was very much a learning experience. So I don't really regret it, except for the friendship that I lost. But another
Oh, dear. Well, you went on to work at Wizards of the Coast, as you said, and one of the things that you worked on whilst you were there was in the late 90s, the Dark Matter
yeah.
role-playing game for the alternative system, which I am a huge fan of. I've always loved it because it just really spoke to me. I'm not sure what it was, but something just grabbed me so much about the game. And you were involved in the final church, the final release that came out for it. So, I mean, what was that process like working on that and working on that line? Do you remember much of it now?
Well, so it was Wolfgang Bauer's big project, and because it involved conspiracies and things like that, I had a whole shelf of what I called nut job books, which were like great role playing fodder, but nothing that I like believed in. It's just why I look around today and I'm like, seriously. But anyway, um, so I um, offered up some of my research skills and some of my books and things to Wolfgang. So I've got like a research credit in the core Dark Matter book, which I could not find in my office yesterday. I know it's here, but I doctored it up. And then J.D. Weicker and I wrote the Final Church, and I couldn't find a PDF of that either, but I did actually dig into my archives and find my turnover for that. So I reread that last night because I hadn't really thought about it in a long time. And man, it's full of history, which is not a surprise because I was going to graduate school for history when I took a little left turn and went into game design. But I had just done the Guide to Hell for second edition AD&D, and I did a lot of D&D research in that, but I also got like a whole raft of books about demons and devils and various traditions around the world, and encyclopedias of angels and devils and all kinds of stuff. And so um, I had all that material like both in my mind and ready at hand. So it was well positioned to work on the final church.
That's great. Yeah, and the final church as an idea has always really appealed to me in the context of the sort of dark matter and the conspiracy games and things like that. But this unknowing collaboration between all of these different cults and all of these different secret societies who are thinking they're sort of acting on their own and doing their own kind of anarchic sort of demonologist stuff. But in reality, they've all been masterminded by a central kind of force. It's an
Yeah,
interesting idea, I think.
yeah. It's funny rereading it. Like I probably wouldn't do it the same way today, simply because it gets humanity a little bit off the hook too much for all of
Hmm.
its actual crimes and so on. But yes, as role playing fodder is good fun, and it let me talk about a bunch of different traditions and historical events. And when I was rereading it last night, I actually was like, is this a real person or did I make that up? And I would do a Google search and be like, oh no, it was a real person. Okay. Good job, past me.
Yeah, well, I've always thought it was a terrific book, a terrific supplement. It was one of the PDF only releases as well, wasn't it? So it didn't actually come out physically, which has always been a real shame, I think. But it was at
Yes.
the very end of the Dark Matter run.
So that was my curse when the period of my WOTC employment that I was in what was called role playing R&D, or actually TSR product group when I first joined, but that kind of went by the wayside. Um, Several of my projects, like I wrote for print release, and then they were relegated to PDF release. And people began to refer to that process internally as having your project get premised. So,
Oh no. Because it was definitely an interesting time for Wizards, wasn't it? Because obviously there'd been the recent takeover of TSR. There was changes to a lot of the lines, updating Dungeons and Dragons. Were you working on any other stuff during that period that was sort of interesting and kind of what was it like being in that world during that time?
it was cool, but also strange. Like, so I started in March of 1998. So this was the tail edition of tail end of second edition D&D. So all the books that I wrote were in that period. Um, and it's a period that really nobody cares to talk about because, um, you know, 2E sales had been dwindling. Uh, Once they announced there was going to be a third edition, of course, everyone was looking forward to that. So, like, when you look at some of the histories that have been written about D&D, they spare a few sentences for basically all the work that I did, the era where I did all my work. So it's kind of a drag. But as someone who was a D&D player since the late 70s, it was super fun to get to work on D&D. And I wrote The Guide to Hell. I guess I mentioned that already, but yes, which was, again, very fun project. And I got to work on a sequel to the old Slave Lords Adventures, which I loved.
Right.
Sean Reynolds and I co-wrote that. It's called Slavers. So that was good. But throughout that time, that's when third edition was being designed and play tested. And so if you were in R&D, in addition to whatever else you did, you were involved in that. We have a lot of my brain. We have a lot of meetings and things to discuss the drafts and the changes and throw around ideas and all kinds of stuff. So, it was exciting to be part of that as well. But after a year and a half writing role-playing books, Wizards was starting up a new miniatures division, and I love miniatures. And at the time, I also kind of had a feeling that it was going to be harder for me to make a mark on the role-playing side because there were still people working there from like 70s TSR. Harold Johnson, Skip Williams, people like that. And I was like, essentially like, how am I going to really get noticed when, I'm working with these people with like unimpeachable pedigree and a long, long history. And I thought, miniatures was something I loved and, a new thing at Wizards. So it would be a chance to really do something new for the company and maybe make more of them work. Which turned out not to be true, but that's what I thought.
Sure, because if I remember correctly, that the Wizards sort of miniatures department that was created around that time was relatively short-lived, wasn't it? In the end,
yes.
And then they brought in some Games Workshop people, I think. Is that right?
Yes, they did. Chaz Elliot, who had done like the graphic design on Rogue Trader, for example, he was already on staff. Actually, he was involved in my interview process. So he was already there. And then we recruited Mike McVey from Workshop. Mike was looking to have some different opportunities. And so we were certainly excited to have someone like Mike join the team. And then the person running it was Bob Watts. And Bob was an old hand from like Grenadier Miniatures. He started working there when he was like 16 or something like that as a caster. He had been involved with Target Games and like Mutant Chronicle stuff, Heartbreaker Minis, I think. Anyway,
sure, yeah.
Lots of stuff. But we were a small team. It was basically the people I mentioned plus Matt Wilson, who went on to found Privateer Press. And then we had this woman named Kim, who did some creature sculpting for us, but did other stuff at Wizards. And Jason Souls, who also went on to Privateer Press, was doing painting for us. But, it was less than 10 people, less than 8 people, really. And yet we had Vince, who was the COO of Wizards at the time, tell us with a straight face, I want you guys to kick Games Workshop's ass. And I'm like, really? the Games Workshop with thousands of employees and a whole retail chain, and like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of SKUs of miniatures that date back, 30 years. Like, yeah, we're definitely we're going to get that job done with 8 people. Um, but even like we had aspirations for things we were going to do, but it was really the internal politics of Wizards that made it extremely difficult, because basically we were a new division. Every division within Wizards was territorial, and so they didn't want to give up power over their IP, or let other people play with it, or anything. So the Magic team didn't want us to do a Magic the Gathering miniatures game, which is something Peter Atkinson asked for. The leadership of role-playing R&D, like, they just didn't really want to work with us when they did the miniatures handbook. Like, I only found out about it because I walked into the game library one day and there was a secret meeting going on about it because they didn't want us to know. I was like,
Right.
it was that kind of shit. And so it was extremely difficult, and went through a bunch of different bosses, and the scope of the game changed. Like, the whole idea was to do a skirmish game as an intro, but then 6 months later to launch a mass battle game, because that's where you could make a lot of money selling people a lot of miniatures. And over the course of multiple bosses, it was eventually made into just a skirmish game. And I was like, you understand the limited scope of what we can sell to people in a skirmish game, right? Like, they can play with 10, 12 miniatures, and anyway, so it eventually came out, and it was only, I think, out in public for a year, because it was up for an Origins Award in 2002, I think it was. And 2 weeks before that, I found out from friends who still worked at Wizards that they were going to cancel it. And I was like, at least wait to see if it wins an Origins Award before you announce that it's canceled. But they didn't. They announced it was canceled, and then it won an Origins Award 2 weeks later. So
Oof, that's rough.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
entire
I gave.
division was taken down following that then as well.
Yeah, well, it was more or less gone already. You know, uh, how much of this story to tell? There was a presentation that my team did to upper management and stuff, and I had written the text to it. And like the night before the meeting, somebody else on my team rewrote all the texts without showing it to me. So when I walked into this meeting and saw the handout, it was like mostly nothing I had ever seen before, which was a great surprise to me. And that meeting did not go well at all. Like, people were demoted, and someone was fired, and then rehired at a much reduced role. And so yes, it was it was difficult. So it wasn't a surprise exactly when they canceled the game.
Right. Right. And it doesn't sound like a surprise that you would then go on to, or during that time, found Green Ronin. So your
Correct.
own company. Yeah. So what was the journey then like to creating Green Ronin and sort of moving into to running your own publishing company at that point?
Yeah, so I started working on the minis team, and it was early in 2000. So third edition D&D was set to come out that August at Gen Con. Um, and I found that I was missing doing some role-playing work. And I thought, well, maybe I'll start a little side venture, just to kind of keep my finger in the RPG pie, as it were. And so initially, I started working on a game called Orc, the role-playing game, with my friend Todd Miller. And this was based on a technically D&D campaign, but not really, that Todd had run in the 90s. it was sort of like, you might call it paranoia with orcs. Very much beer and pretzels, kind of funny game. And when we were playing it, Todd would just be like, roll some dice, and then he'd decide. So I designed an actual game system for it. So that was our first product. But then in the middle of that happening, that's when the open game license was being floated internally at Wizards. And I remember being in a meeting, and it was talked about that Wizards had a very difficult time being agile because it was so big and it worked far in advance, and it was hard to turn a big ship on a dime and that sort of stuff. And also they were hoping that smaller companies would basically do the job of putting out short adventures because they were not hugely profitable for Wizards to do. So I was like, well, shit, I can be agile and I can write short D&D adventures. So let's give it a shot. So that led to Death and Free Ports, so basically in July of 2000, Orc came out. And then 1 month later at Gen Con, same day as the Player's Handbook, we had Death and Freeport for sale at Gen Con. And older people in the industry were extremely wary of the open game license. They thought it was like a trap. And the Wizards was trying to destroy all other role-playing games. But I was like, well, I got nothing to lose, basically. So we jumped into it, and that turned out to be a great decision. By the end of that Gen Con, I was walking through hotels and seeing people playing it like on the floor, in a hotel lobby or things like that. And then, we sold like 10,000 copies of that, which were numbers I had never seen, in my previous experience working in role games. So it was a great start, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds like just being at the perfect place and time to get started. Yeah, and then from there over the next couple of years, obviously Green Ronin continued to produce stuff, but you then came to work with Games Workshop on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Second Edition.
Correct.
So how did that come to be? How did that all get started?
Well, probably the first seeds of that were sown in 1995. I was friends with James Wallace, who was running Hogshead at the time. And there was a Gen Con where Hogshead and my first company, Ronin Publishing, agreed to share a booth. So I was working in a booth with James. And he had brought with him Mark Gascoigne, who I'm sure you know, who worked at Games Workshop in the 80s and then came back later to co-found Black Library. Mark is also an old punk, and I walked into the booth wearing a rudimentary Peni t-shirt for an old British punk band, and he was like, God, like didn't expect to see that at an American Game Convention. So, we got to talking and became friends after that. So later, when they founded Black Library, I wrote some short stories for them. This was shortly before I went to work for Wizards. And through that, I met Andy Jones. And then a few years later, I was at Game of Trade Show, and Andy Jones was there and wanted to have a conversation with me because they were thinking about bringing Warhammer Roleplay back, and would Green Ronin be interested in being involved in some way? I was like, show me where to sign. So that was the beginnings of that deal, and then they spun up Black Industries as a role-playing imprint at Workshop, and then we worked with them for the rest of that period.
Yeah, and because it was published by Black Industries, but it was all developed by you guys at Green Ronin, right?
Yeah. Working with Games Workshop, obviously, we had to get all their feedback and make whatever changes they wanted. But we also got to go to Nottingham like at least once a year we would like spend a week there, but just have meetings at HQ all week and meet with different people and talk about our plans and stuff like that. So, there was a meeting where like John Blanche came in and he had some of his like sketchbooks, which I don't know if you've ever seen them, but it's like they're like illuminated manuscripts essentially, where he's like pasted in different references, but then he's drawn all over it, and there's text and art, and get to page through one of those things. Like I felt like I was in like a medieval monastery, like, oh, look at this manuscript. So stuff like that was super fun.
Yeah, I mean that sounds incredible. And then, what was the development process like then for the second edition? Because, as you said, the Hogshead had continued to publish the first edition. They'd sort of refined it a little bit, but continued to produce material using the original rule system and continue that version of the game. When you came to be working on it, that was a true second edition. So you sort of started from the ground up in many ways. What sort of led to that decision, and how did that work?
Well, they were interested in a new edition. They didn't want to just reprint the first edition again. And because I had played Warhammer for so long, I had a lot of ideas about things that I would like to change about the game. So I was able to implement a lot of that stuff. But we also had we had a team working on it. So, different people contributed different things. But the idea was just really to kind of update the design a little bit to make things a little smoother in some places. First edition Wolfrup, like when the core rulebook came out, you could still see some of the D&D influence in it. Like the adventure in it is like a dungeon crawl essentially, and a lot of what people think about as the Wolfrup style didn't actually develop until the Enemy Within campaign. And so, we also wanted a core rule book that better reflected like the aesthetic and the, how the Warhammer world had developed and the iconic things about it.
Yeah, and you were also working in the sort of aftermath or around changes to the Warhammer world that were taking place in the tabletop game as well. Is that
Yeah.
It was the storm of chaos, and you were sort of reflecting some of that in the books that you were writing. Was that part of that initial agreement as well? I'm guessing Games Workshop said that this is how we want to take it forward.
Yep. Yeah. So at the time they were trying to keep a timeline current, which is difficult if you've ever run an IP before, particularly one that is so far-reaching as Warhammer. So yeah, the Storm of Chaos was basically just ending, and they wanted us to reflect the changes to the world. And I would have preferred to either keep it in the original timeline or to have it happen during the Storm of Chaos, and then to have like an adventure series about that. But because it had basically passed, we had to deal with the aftermath of the Storm of Chaos. So when we did like the God, what was it even called? Sigmar's Heirs? It's called the Empire source book. Whole swathes of the northeast of the Empire. It's just like, this village is destroyed. This village is destroyed. Guess what? This village also destroyed. And I felt like, that wasn't exactly ideal. But we did our best.
Yeah, and did that play into, because I'm right in saying the Enemy Within didn't feature in the second edition, so there wasn't a full reprint of it. Was that because of sort of how it might have worked in that context? Or was it just something that never came up as a let's republish that?
No, we talked about it, but I felt like since this was a new edition, that we actually want to create something new rather than start off with, retreading something that had not only been done before, but was like a recognized classic even at that point. I thought, let's write our own chapter in the history of Warhammer. And the idea was maybe eventually we'd do it, but we weren't going to start that way. So yeah, it wasn't really Storm of Chaos. It was just more like wanting to offer people new things.
Mm. Yeah, and you did the Paths of the Damned campaign
Yep.
that sort of really took in a lot of that post Storm of Chaos empire and sort of reflected a lot of and explored a lot of the cities and how they changed as a result of it. I mean, that must
Yep.
have been quite an interesting process because obviously the original WFRP actually helped deepen and broaden the Warhammer world beyond what was in the tabletop. So I'm sort of imagining it was almost a similar thing for you guys working on a lot of lore that hadn't been written yet. Did it feel like that?
Uh, well, yeah. I mean, what you need for like a mass battle miniatures game and what you need for a role playing game are different, right? So, it made sense that Wolfrip One really delved more into the world, and yeah, we were able to provide info on cities and culture and other stuff like that the minis game wouldn't go into at that depth. So it was fun to do, and I got Graham Davis to work on the first installment. So that was a nice nod to the history. And Shadows over Bogenhofen, still one of my favorite adventures, and Graham did that. So it's cool.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the books, the source books that came out over the life of the second edition, a lot of those are still really highly regarded. I mean, you've got books about Kislevs and you've got books about vampires and Night's Dark Masters and things like that are very people still love and are still sought after. I mean, was there any particular source book, any particular supplement that you had the most fun working on and sort of pulling together for the edition?
Well, so I worked on the initial suite of products, and then Rob Schwab took over as the line developer after that. So Rob was more intimately involved with things after the first, I don't know, 8 months or something. The bestiary was fun to do. Working with T.S. Lugart, who now works on the current version of Wolfrip, and Ian Sturrock on that was super fun. There's a lot of lore in that book, and I did most of the stat blocks because I knew the system. But yeah, that was good fun, and that was a well-regarded book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just looping back around to the system, was there anything you mentioned there were a few things that you sort of wanted to reflect and change and sort of revise?
Mhm.
Is there anything that you look back on and sort of think that was a real win? I'm really pleased we did that. Or even something that you thought, actually, in terms of systems and mechanics, we probably could have tweaked even further or changed or sort of worked on a little bit more.
I wish we had done more work on the like insanity system. We tried to do something that instead of using like modern day clinical terms for actual mental illnesses, we would do things more like in world.
Mm,
But I think that could have used some more development. But the biggest thing that I like, which I know that some people hate, but that was first playing Wolfrup, and like you're rolling up random careers. Like it was just like a winners and losers thing,
mm,
where it's like, oh, did you roll an outlaw? You got everything under the sun, man. Like tons of abilities and skills and things like that. Did you roll a road warden? You can ride a horse. That's it, bro. You're gonna have to pay 100 XP for every other skill you ever want to learn. And I just never liked that idea. So I created like a little template of like each basic career should have roughly between this and this number of skills and talents. So even though you might roll up something with a low status like a rat catcher, at least game wise, you would have the same number of resources to draw on as somebody who is a noble or something like that.
mm.
So I know some people hate the idea of game balance in but I just think it's more fun to play if you're not looking at someone else's character and be like, why am I here?
Sure.
If you see what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah, I absolutely do. Yeah, I mean, enough Wolf Up games where you just feel like you can't do anything, and you've rolled poorly, and you just it can be a brutal game, which obviously is part of the charm as well. But yeah, there's definitely that opportunity to tweak it and refine it, I
Yeah.
think.
And that goes back a little bit to the RuneQuest heritage, actually,
Mm,
because I remember the first time I played RuneQuest was in college, and it was a similar sort of deal where we like rolled randomly on a background chart, and one of our members got like a 99 or something on percentile dice. So he was a noble, he had armor and a horse, and all this stuff, and the rest of us were basically like scum. So, so he'd be like riding, and we were in the mud, and he'd be like, "Oh, look at that guy."
which I guess can throw up some interesting role play opportunities, but can
It
also
can.
feel really
Yeah.
really rough sometimes.
Just like at the table, you want everyone to feel like they have an equal chance to contribute,
Hmm.
So, I mean, that's my feeling.
So the second edition ran for a number of years until the black industry sort of, well, the entire publishing arm was sort of wound down by Games Workshop
Mm-hmm.
in about 2008. What was it like as you sort of came to that point and were no longer able to work on Wolf Rub? How did it sort of take place? Did Games Workshop call you one day and say, right, that's it, we're done, or was there a sort of wind down? Or
Well, so before they closed up Black Industries, our deal had actually concluded. So our license had run out,
hmm,
and they decided they wanted to handle things like the 40K RPG in-house.
hmm,
Because I had done some initial design work on that, which was going to be just a different system.
right.
And they wanted to use the Wolfrip system for it, which honestly I didn't think was great for 40K, because you had to have a range from like Imperial Guardsmen to Space Marines to Greater Demons. And I don't know. I thought it was problematic, but
Hmm.
hey, they published tons of books for it between them and Fantasy Flight. So
Well,
I
and
guess,
they still had to solve that problem through almost exactly what you're saying there, because the scale is so wide. You can play so many different power levels. Ultimately, they released four different role-playing
yeah.
games to cover
Yep.
the different range. So, yeah, they still had to face into that same challenge, didn't they?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we were out of it by that point. And so when they announced the closure, I mean, it was a surprise because it was like on a Friday, Dark Heresy came out and sold like 30,000 copies or something. And on Monday, they closed up the division and either fired or transferred people around the company. So that was a surprise. So then, the question became, well, what's going to happen to these games? Um, so I went back to Games Workshop and I was like, hey, would you license these games back to us? Because, we did the whole second edition line and all that. And we were told that, oh, well, maybe, we should put a proposal together, but it would probably be a few months before they really started to look at that. And I was like, okay. But then Alan Merritt took a trip to America and went to Fantasy Flight. And from what I understand, he just wanted to deal with all the licensing stuff in one fell swoop. So he just signed this all-encompassing deal with Fantasy Flight for RPGs, card games, board games, like the whole lot. So we never even got a real chance to pitch for it, and it was literally like 2 weeks later. I was like, oh, it'll be some months. 2 weeks later, this deal has been signed. And I was like, oh. But we did end up doing a last couple of Wolfram 2 books for Fantasy Flight. Um, and they didn't tell us they were working on a third edition at the time, which was not great. So that explained more why they wanted us to do second edition stuff because they were already working on third.
Right.
But that's when we did Shades of Empire.
Right.
Yeah.
So was that, you think that essentially to keep Wolf product coming out during that interim period whilst the third edition was being prepared?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was there anything then that you had sort of in your minds that the team might have wanted to work on or given some thought to or been prepping before those changes, before the license agreements ended and before all that happened?
Yeah, actually, I I wanted to do a third edition where the core rule book wasn't tied to one point in time, that it basically would present three different eras that you could play in, and then we could have source books about those different eras. So one would be, the classic Enemy Within time. One would be the Age of Three Emperors. And then maybe one for Storm of Chaos, although my wild idea was to go back to the time of Sigmar and play through that era when you're uniting the tribes and, fighting in Blackfire Pass and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I couldn't get any traction on that from Games Workshop. They weren't interested in that approach, but I thought it could have been super cool.
I mean, that sounds super cool. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like the sound of that a lot. And curiously enough, we've just heard that there's now going to be an old world RPG coming
Yeah.
that is going to be set in the Age of Three Emperors and sort of look at that period. So it's almost, you were ahead of your time there with that one, I think.
Yeah, yes. Well, I noted that with great interest the other day.
So we
I
now
thought
just
they
need
might
to,
do it.
yeah, there
I
might be
thought
an
they might do a
announcement.
source book. Go
Sorry,
on.
you
Oh,
were
I
saying
thought
there,
they
Chris.
might do a source book for the current game.
Mm,
I didn't expect they would do a whole other game. So that's interesting.
yeah, absolutely, and it'll be interesting to see how that sort of plays out. And it will also be interesting to see if they end up doing an adventure or an RPG set in the age of Sigmar, and then we'll know people have been
Mhm.
reading your notes, taking a look. But so that was, I mean, obviously that was a sort of a big shift and a big change. Where did Green Ronin go after that? What was the sort of next project that you guys took on?
Well, so um, basically, we had a huge crisis around the time that we were doing the Warhammer stuff for Games Workshop. We had been working with a fulfillment house called Ossium Entertainment, which was founded by two guys that I knew from Wizards. And for a few years, they were great at selling our stuff, getting it into the book trade and hobby stores and all that stuff. But they took on a lot of clients from the D20 boom. And then as the boom slowly began turning into a bust,
Hmm.
they were making less money and they had all these clients. And so um, at a certain point, like they tried to kind of disguise what was going on, but eventually they were using money from us to keep their company going. So like we released what was it? The Advanced Bestiary and like the Black Company source book, and we didn't actually see any money for a lot of those sales because they took it.
Oh dear.
And then they like literally disappeared. Like one of the guys lived in Seattle, and Nicole like drove to his house, talked to him once, and then after that, he just fled the state. He fled to Florida. We didn't have
Wow.
any idea where he was for like 8 years, something like that. Um, so this was a huge problem for us. And thankfully, we had the separate income stream coming from Wolfram 2. So that really kind of saved our bacon. If we didn't have that, probably we would have gone out of business at that point. But thanks, Warhammer. We were able to get through that. And we also had done our Mutants and Masterminds role playing game. And that has been like the steady horse of Green Ronin. It's in its third edition now, came out in 2002, 2024, it's still going. So that was happening in that period. And then post Warhammer, and also, spinning out of the D20 era, we started designing more of our own systems. We started getting other licenses. So we got the Game of Thrones license before HBO started their whole thing.
Hmm.
Uh, so I was able to just negotiate directly with George R. R. Martin and get licenses to do a Wild Cards source book for Mutants and Masterminds, and then a full Game of Thrones RPG. So that helped a lot. And then when the TV show started, of course, it was great for us because all of a sudden that world was getting in front of a lot of eyeballs. We also made a deal with DC Comics a little bit later, and we did a game called DC Adventures, which was the debut of third edition Mutants and Masterminds. And we published that for a few years, and that was also great. So we were able to get through it.
So you created the adventure game engine as well, and were able to use that in a number of different ways. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Chris?
Yes, absolutely. It was a system that I designed for our Dragon Age role-playing game initially. It was one of those great moments where somebody comes to you for a license thing. So BioWare contacted me and was like, "Hey, we're doing a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, and we think it'd be cool, like as a nod to the RPG roots, if there's a tabletop game to go along with it. And do you want to do it?" And I was like, "Let me think about that." Yes. So they sent me the info they had about the world, which was not a lot at that point. This is before the first game even came out. And I designed the system with the idea of taking video game players and showing them what was cool about tabletop. So the first release was a box set with a player's book, a GM book, dice, and a map, that starter set kind of experience. And that was a big success for us. And so people really liked the game system, the adventure game engine. And people almost immediately were saying, "Hey, could we get a version of these rules that aren't tied to the Dragon Age world?" And so we were planning to do it at a certain point, but we hadn't fully decided to do it. But then I had appeared on Will Wheaton's tabletop show running Dragon Age for him and Sam Witwer and some other people. And Will really liked the system. And when he went to make an RPG show, he told me he wanted to use the age system because he really liked it. And so that was the impetus to design the Fantasy Age basic rule book. And then he and I and his son created this techno fantasy setting called Titan's Grave. And then they did a 10-episode show, which you can still watch on YouTube, that shows you what's great about role-playing games and what a campaign can look like. And then we had the rule book and the Titan's Grave book like at Gen Con the summer that was released, and Will was there, and it was a big thing. So that was awesome. And then since then the age system has basically become our house system. So now it powers our Blue Rose game, our new Cthulhu Awakens game. We did Modern Age. It's going to be the system for our upcoming 5th season game. So a lot of stuff. And each time we do a different game, we kind of optimize the engine for whatever the genre or topic is. So, 5th season is going to be different than Blue Rose, and Cthulhu Awakens is different from everything because, different parameters. And so, yeah, that, designing Dragon Age became a important turning point for the company.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and who came up with the name as well? Because that's terrific. I really like that. So that you can then use it, Dragon Age, Modern Age, all those sort of different permutations.
It was either me or Steve Kenson. Might have been Steve Kenson, who came up with what the acronym would stand for.
Yeah, it's fun. That's really good.
Yeah. And we're going to start a zine soon called Engine, which is basically like the zine for age games. So it'll have articles for all the different games, a place we can experiment and do some interesting stuff without doing like a full source book or something like that. That'll also be fun.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like lots of interesting and exciting different projects there. I mean, how have you mentioned a couple of things there. I mean, obviously there's the D20 system, the OGL, all that sort of stuff. But from within the industry, how have you sort of seen it change over time? So is it still the same kind of markets, the same kind of products, the same kind of industry today as it was when you were first getting started, or has it shifted quite a lot?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, almost everything is different. When I got into the industry, there was no electronic publishing, just wasn't a thing. There wasn't print on demand. If you were going to do a print run, you had to do really at least 1,000 books, or it just cost too much per unit. So you couldn't be like, I'm doing a print run of 50, which is what you began to see later. People show up at Gen Con with 50 copies, and that was their print run. Well, you couldn't do that. You have to get at least 1,000, and you might be sad if you only sold 100. But so there was that. And then later in the 90s, Hero Games started to sell PDFs of some of their books, but they were selling them on 3.5 discs. So you would like go to their booth and they would have a 3.5 disc like on a piece of cardboard that was shrink wrapped. And some of the books only came out in that version. But they were sort of ahead of that game. And then this was around 2000. God, what was it called? RPG Now started and really broke the PDF market. We waited a little longer than we should to dive into that. But that became a whole viable thing. The print on demand you saw in the later 90s was terrible. I mean, you could see from across the room that something was a POD book. But that technology has improved massively. So, that became more viable. Then you had the open game license, which caused a big explosion of new companies, and some new ideas and things like that. Um, and there's just been like multiple generations since then. So like I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 right now, and it's not the Baldur's Gate game that you might have played for second or even third edition D&D, because today, like, people love playing tieflings, and other, what formerly considered more monstrous things. Like, people are like, monsters are cool, I want to play one. So your adventuring party there, it's like very different in character than what you might have seen in classic D&D, but that reflects what some of the younger people getting into role playing now, like, that's what they want. So tastes have also changed. So yeah, many many things have changed. There was a while there where it seemed like the whole distribution network was in danger. The industry traditionally has operated in what's called the three-tier system, which is publishers who sell to distributors who sell to game stores. And that's how you would get your books into a lot of stores. So you weren't dealing individually with retail stores, like, what does this one store want? And that ground was shaky for a while. There were some ones that went out of business. There was some consolidation. People started doing lots of direct sales. But eventually, people on the retail end and the distribution end figured some things out. In particular, the enormous growth of playing games in stores. That was very rare to see in the 90s. And people started doing this like cafe model in the aughts of like, oh, we've got an attached cafe and you can hang out and play games there and things like that. And that's really, that's changed the nature of game stores like quite a lot as well. So
yeah,
many
absolutely.
things.
I mean, does it
Yeah.
feel bigger to you, the market overall? Like, has it grown over time, do you think, with more people coming in, or is it sort of around the same sort of size, do you think?
No, it's definitely grown. I mean, fifth edition D&D, like, until Wizards shot itself in the dick, like, it was really growing. much to a much greater extent than even Wizards expected when they released fifth edition. I mean, when fifth edition came out, it was almost kind of tentative after fourth edition, which was kind of like the nadir of things. But there were some smart people there, and they were able to bring in like a whole new generation of D&D players. You know, some of whom we were able to grab and get buying our stuff too. But that's the eternal struggle of any non D&D publishing RPG company, is to try to get people to try games that are different than D&D, because there's so many of them. But anyway, Wizards itself became $1 billion company like within Hasbro, because of Magic continuing to grow, and also because of D&D continuing to grow. But the smartest person that I know who was working there rage quit over the OGL debacle, because he had spent like a year telling them, this is stupid, you shouldn't do it. It's going to be bad for us. And lo and behold, it was a PR disaster.
It was indeed, yeah. I mean, just looping it back around to the electronic distribution point. Do you feel is that only a good thing? I'm just curious from a business perspective, because obviously that sort of changes the value proposition for a product. Because whereas it used to be all the effort that was going into it was then coming out with a physical product that you can sort of hold and has a certain inherent value. Do you see that? Are you able to sort of recoup the same kind of value and profits from a digital only release, or does that sort of change things in the calculus a little bit?
Well, so when you sell into distribution, you're already selling at half of the regular retail price,
Right.
or even more, depending on, there's factors. But basically, like when you're actually getting paid for like a $50 book, you're getting 35% of the cover price. The rest
Right.
goes to distribution and to the retail partners and things like that. So if you can sell a PDF for half of MSRP of the print book, just as good. you know. Now, it's not like we don't know people are sharing PDFs, and there's huge pirate sites and whatever. But a lot of people, like, they collect PDFs. They don't necessarily actually read them. It's like, this is my collection. So whatever with those people. And there's enough people who recognize that they need to give money to the people making the games that they like, or they won't make the games that they like anymore. So it's all good.
Yeah.
I guess I failed to mention also the rise of crowdfunding, and then also virtual tabletops. And both of those things have been hugely important in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, imagine virtual tabletops in particular has definitely given global events over the last couple of years been a super
Mm-hmm.
important factor in keeping a lot of games going and a lot of things still being used and played.
Yeah, we were sadly a little behind in that arena. So when quarantine started, we were like, oh, okay, we really need to dedicate more resources to this. And so we hired a guy named Jonesy, Stephen Jones, to take on doing our virtual tabletop stuff. And he was able to get a lot of support out for that. And we're just now about to release like a full game on Roll20 that has the compendium, the full contents of the rule book, and like all of that stuff. And that's for our Cthulhu Awakens game, which is just about to be fulfilled to Kickstarter backers. And then it'll be on sale to the public.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And
Mm.
then you've got another Kickstarter coming up. Is that right? Can you talk a
Yes.
little bit about that?
Yeah. So tomorrow, as we record this, we are launching the Valiant Adventures role-playing game. And so this is, again, the Mutants and Mastermind system, teamed up with the Valiant Comics universe. So we're doing two books are the core of it. There's the Valiant Adventures Heroes Handbook, and the Worlds of Valiant sourcebook. The Valiant Adventures Heroes Handbook is kind of based on a previous M&M book called the Basic Heroes Handbook, which was a little bit of an easier way to get into the game. And then, there's some rules development and some tweaks to better reflect the nature of the Valiant universe, and also just to do some things a little better than they had been done before. So there's interesting stuff for existing M&M fans and of course Valiant fans.
That's fantastic.
That runs until February 21st, 2024. So if you're watching this before then, go back.
Absolutely, and I'll put a link in the description below so people can go and check it out as well once it's live. So that's terrific. I mean, Chris, it's been so interesting talking to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to sort of share some of your memories and talk a little bit about the industry and some of the games you worked on. It's really been fantastic. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun.
I'd like to thank Chris for taking the time to chat to me about his experiences in the RPG industry. Absolutely fascinating stuff. It was really great to hear from him. If you want to check out Green Ronin's Valiant Adventures RPG, then I've put a link in the description to the Kickstarter. So give it a look if you fancy some superheroic adventures in the Valiant Comics universe. You will also find in the description links to my Patreon, my Ko-fi, and my Discord if you want to support the channel. And you can also use my affiliate links for Element Games for all of your hobby needs, and that really benefits the channel as well. Thank you once again to Chris. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.